I've encountered divergence in the Force. A boy. His cells have the highest concentration of midichlorians I have seen in a life form.
You refer to the prophecy of the one who will bring balance to the Force.
I'm a person. My name is Anakin.
You will be a Jedi. I promise.
I don't want things to change.
Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. I sense much fear in you.
I shouldn't have done that. It's not the Jedi way. Just help me save Padme's life. I can't live without her.
Only through me can you achieve a power greater than any Jedi.
I'm sorry.
I have seen, and it is the Jedi who will stand in the way of peace.
What have you done?
You are the chosen one! I hate you! For my brother Anakin!
The psychology of Darth Vader and Anakin Skywalker, a topic that was incredibly hard to put together, and not necessarily because it was hard to understand him, but rather because of how many variables play a part in his transformation. After all, it's quite the leap to take, isn't it? I mean, how exactly does someone go from extremely empathetic slave boy to an angst-ridden Jedi Knight, and all the way to ruthless and unforgiving Sith Lord? Questions that I'll be tackling in today's episode of Dissecting Minds, a video series focused on the psychology behind the most perplexing beings, where I do my best to try and understand why some people, fictional or real, act and think the way they do. And given that Star Wars is my favorite movie franchise, and that there are hardly any videos on this channel about it, I decided to make this the very first video of Star Wars month. A period of 3 to 5 weeks where I'll be tackling everything Star Wars on this channel. And so today, we'll be starting off by going in depth into the mind of Anakin Skywalker and his shadow self, also known as Darth Vader. Now, before I can explain how Anakin fell to the dark side and what factors played a role in his downfall, it's important that we first analyze his backstory, how he came to be and what variables in his life influenced him in what ways. And for that, we need to go back to where it all started, Tatooine. A hot, dry and desolate planet where our main protagonist was born and raised. And it's also here that we find out that Anakin Skywalker is not a regular boy, he's a slave. One that was raised and even conceived without a father. One that only knew love from one person, his mother. The woman in his life that represented the only safe harbor Anakin ever had. The one person he loved more than anyone or anything else. And it was also her who taught to Anakin to show compassion to others and to do his best to help them as well if he can. Leading him to become an incredibly capable young boy. Because aside from being a great pilot already, he also has a natural gift for fixing things. There's no mechanical problem that he can't solve. Things soon change though when he meets Qui-Gon Jinn, because for the first time he sees in this Jedi Master a father figure, one that may put limits on him and may be able to help him deal with his more rebellious and aggressive side, one that may finally fulfill his need for a complete family. But things don't turn out quite like he expects. His father figure dies as quickly as he obtains it, He's then taken in by a group of religious zealots who don't fully trust him on a planet that is the polar opposite of his home. And to top things off, he also had to leave his mother behind in the grasp of slavery. And uncertain and fearful about her future, he's then simply told to move on. To forget all past attachments he once had, and to go the way of the Jedi. But Anakin's bond to his mother is way too strong. And as someone who myself also grew up without a father and who had to move countries during my childhood, I completely understand Anakin's relationship to his mom. This experience that both him and I share, it kinda puts you in a position where you realize that nothing is certain, that everything about what you thought was normal can change in an instant. And so therefore, having at least one anchor you can rely on is incredibly important. An anchor that keeps you grounded regardless of where you end up, regardless of how much around you changes. A mother that will always be there for you. But obviously that's not a privilege Anakin was able to hold on to for very long. He soon starts to have nightmares about his mother's death, and in a world where Force users have the ability to foresee the future, this is obviously incredibly upsetting, and so he falls into a deep state of anxiety and despair. And whenever he tries to ask for help, he's simply told to be mindful of his emotions and to rejoice over the people he may lose.
These visions you have.
They're of pain, suffering, death.
Death is a natural part of life. Rejoice for those around you who transform into the Force. Mourn them, do not. Miss them, do not.
What must I do, Master Yoda?
Train yourself to let go of everything you fear to lose.
And then, everything boils over when his mother dies in his arms. In this moment, Anakin loses the one person he knew he could count on. The one person that represented stability in his life. Which is also why, afterwards, he simply loses it, all of it. There is now nothing that is certain within him. For all he knows, nothing is guaranteed and nothing needs to make sense. Principles, morals, none of that matters anymore. If everything can be changed and destroyed, then why should he hold on to these principles and not change himself? Why not give in to this anger that he feels inside? And this moment here is what fueled the decay of Anakin Skywalker as a character. For the first time, he became fully aware of this anger he's been suppressing for all his life. An anger that, while scary, is still a part of who he is. But instead of tackling it, he ignores it, hides it, and worst of all, tries to justify it. And to be honest, of course he would. After all, that's all the Jedi ever taught him to do regarding his fears and emotions. And furthermore, this is also where Anakin signed his death sentence. It's when he decided to repress his emotions that he started to look for other ways to deal with the pain he was enduring. And so, instead of learning to accept that death is an inevitable aspect of life, he swore to never allow anyone he loves to die again. And while this may sound like a foolish and childish ideal, let's not forget that he is in deep emotional pain and he was never taught on how to deal with such emotions. And so, it's more than logical for him to come to the conclusion that the only way to prevent all this agony is to make sure the situation doesn't occur again. To make sure that he finds a way to save the ones he loves from dying.
I will be the most powerful Jedi ever. I promise you. I will even learn to stop people from dying.
Anakin.
Everything I just said, though, is what leads to Anakin's death. In one fell swoop, he put a desire for an unachievable power above all his principles and simultaneously left himself open to easy manipulation by others. Because whoever were to come into his life and offer up a solution to his problem, well, he wouldn't think twice before taking the bait. Which is the perfect setup for Palpatine, who comes in, treats Anakin with respect, becomes the father figure he so desperately desired, and then even offers him a way to save Padme, the mother of his future children, the person that became Anakin's new anchor. The one person he would destroy the world for, because she is for him the one person who became his entire world. And poetically enough, that's exactly what happens. Anakin, the lost boy who only ever wanted a family, became so unable to deal with grief and loss that he tried everything to solve it by seeking more and more power, more and more control over everything around him, until he eventually loses everything and then seizes all control of himself, giving himself over to the repressed feelings he never dared to address. The shadow within himself that knows nothing else but rage, anger, and death. Anakin was no more, only his shadow self, known as none other than Darth Vader. Now that we went through Anakin's upbringing and what events led to his demise from an outside perspective, let's try and see if we can diagnose him. And while I'd normally agree that simply throwing around psychological terms won't help most people understand someone else better, in the case of Anakin and Darth Vader, it can actually be quite helpful because throughout his entire life, he goes through various conditions and disorders, oftentimes one causing and/or leading into the next. And so, diagnosing him will hopefully make it easier for us to try and understand what was going on the inside. So, where do we start? I think the first condition to look at is Anakin's separation anxiety. This is a condition that is most often associated with children, but can also occur in adults as well. It's basically a circumstance where the person may develop extreme anxiety due to the separation or expected separation from a specific attachment figure, which could be a person, a place, or even a pet. A trait that we can easily observe within young and teenage Anakin. He's a boy who had to deal with so much upset in his life that the last thing he wants now is even more change. And especially if that change involves his mother dying. And his anxiety, well, it manifests itself in the form of obsessing about everything surrounding his mother. To the point even where I'd say that he could even classify for PTSD. Now, I'm not talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, though he may very well be showing signs of that as well, given that PTSD is often linked with having nightmares of the trauma in question. But I think that at this point of his life, before his mother dies, what he really has is pre-traumatic stress disorder. And on a side note, I actually thought I was making this term up, given that I only came to this expression because Jedi are able to see into the future, but this condition actually exists in real life as well. It's when people become consumed with prolonged and/or significant anxiety about a potentially threatening or otherwise devastating event that may occur in the future. Think of something like over-worrying whether you'll be able to pay rent this month, or whether your mother may die or not because she's in the hospital. Either way though, Anakin clearly shows signs of this form of PTSD for sure. He is constantly having nightmares about the future and also tries to avoid talking about it with Padme, leading to an extreme amount of angst and panic to arise. And I think that, up to this point, Anakin's diagnosis shows to us that this boy may be lost, but he simply has a deep care for the people he loves. A love that is so strong that the fear of losing it haunts him unlike anything else. And while this on its own isn't something bad, it's here where Anakin's inherent nature escalates things to a point of no return. Because, as mentioned before, Anakin is a boy who loves to fix things. It's simply a part of who he is. But the problem is that fixing machines doesn't translate all that well to emotional real-life problems. Something made out of bolts and wires is one thing. While there is no mechanical problem that can't be solved, there are many human problems that are insolvable. The most notable of them all being death itself. There is no real way around it, and if one does not accept this truth, they'll end up falling into an endless pit of neuroticism. Now, what is neuroticism? I think I'll let Dr. Jordan Peterson explain this one for me.
That dimension, neuroticism, if you're in a rough environment and you're low in neuroticism, that's pretty damn helpful, because imagine that what neuroticism is, unit of psychophysiological upset caused per unit of stress.
Yeah.
And or unit of danger. And some people overreact and some people underreact. Sometimes the overreaction saves your life. Sometimes the underreaction gets you killed. So it's not like there's a clear answer. So there's variability there.
So, neuroticism is basically how much you are capable of dealing with the stressors of life. How much and to which degree do various burdens affect you? Now, as Dr. Peterson put himself, there's no clear answer as to what is better to have, a high or low amount of neuroticism. It strongly depends on the environment and situation you're in. Sometimes, obsessing about a stressor can save your life because it allowed you to find the proper solutions to deal with said stressor. But other times, it can also make you neurotic about everything around you, make you obsessed with the smallest of things, and also make you feel hopelessly helpless in the process. And unfortunately, that is what happens to Anakin. The fear of losing his mother leads him into a state of chronic anxiety, making him put aside everything he ever believed in so that he can only focus on this one tragedy alone. But in the end, not even that amount of obsessing was able to save his mother. And it leaves him completely destroyed after she dies. He became so high in neuroticism, in other words, so high in not being able to deal with the stressors of his life, that he was willing to give up everything just so he could finally find a solution. Just so he could finally fix things.
I wasn't strong enough to save you, Mom. But I promise I won't fail again.
And this obsession with outsmarting death is what leads Anakin into a state of mental distress called cognitive dissonance, where someone holds multiple contradicting beliefs at the same time. At this point, Anakin is so lost, he doesn't even care what path to take as long as the path gets him out of the hole he's in, which is also why he's willing to consider all available options, no matter how much they may differ from his current worldview. And for a boy who had to learn early on that everything can change in an instant, it was definitely not helpful for him to end up in a position now where he literally starts to question everything and everyone. And so, Anakin gets stuck believing various conflicting thoughts at the same time. Killing innocent people is wrong, but then why did it feel so good? He's a Jedi, he knows he's better than this. But then why does he also know that he'd do it all over again if he had to? He knows that his mother died, but then why won't he accept that others may die as well? He also knows that killing an unarmed Count Dooku is not the Jedi way, but then why did Mace Windu, a Jedi Master, kill Jango Fett after having disarmed him already? He knows that the Jedi only think of others, but then why won't they think of him? He knows that the Jedi are honorable and good, but then why do they want him to spy on a friend he trusts? And he also knows that he shouldn't attack Mace Windu. But then, why won't Mace keep Palpatine alive? He knows he shouldn't kill innocent children, but at this point, what does he really know? It seems like his whole life was built on lies upon lies, one contradiction after the other. All he wants is a family, and at this point, he doesn't know who to trust anymore when it comes to that. The fear of loss is now the only thing he truly knows, and so therefore, everything else is up for debate. All principles, all morals, everything can be changed if it only means that he can save the people he loves from dying. And so, all of this cognitive dissonance, all of these opposing viewpoints he was holding at the same time, inevitably lead Anakin into developing a borderline personality disorder, a condition that impacts the way you think and feel about yourself and others, putting you literally in a borderline state, meaning that you are struggling to figure out what life you want for yourself. You are on the border between two strongly opposing views of the world. In our case, on the border between the Jedi and the Sith way. And the characteristics of this disorder strongly represent Anakin at the end of Revenge of the Sith, because it often includes symptoms like intense fear of abandonment, even going to extreme measures to avoid the separation. Check. A pattern of unstable and intense relationships, such as idealizing someone in one moment and then suddenly believing the person doesn't care enough or that they're even cruel. Check. Rapid changes in self-identity and self-image. Check. Periods of stress-related paranoia and loss of contact with reality. Check. Impulsive and risky behavior. Check. Suicidal threats or behavior. No, I don't think so. Wide mood swings. Definitely check. Ongoing feelings of emptiness. That one's hard to say, but probably yes, maybe. And finally, inappropriate, intense anger such as frequently losing your temper. Definitely a check as well. And so, I think Anakin clearly shows 8 out of 9 criteria for borderline personality disorder. But in my opinion, this was only the final stage of Anakin's psyche. All the other conditions are what set up everything perfectly so that it could manifest itself in this final form of his. And I say final because this is where Anakin as a person dies. He spent a good portion of his life trying to figure out what will finally work for him, but in the end, he clearly made the wrong choice and lost everything and everyone because of it. And given that Anakin's character was so strongly tied to the people he loves, once he lost all of them, there was also hardly anything left of Anakin to survive. He, as a person, he died off. And then, he became what is known as the Dark Triad in psychology, combining the personality traits of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And feel free to pause the video to better understand these terms. But needless to say though, this was most certainly not Anakin Skywalker anymore. All that was left now was Darth Vader, a husk of his former self, the embodiment of all his deeply repressed emotions and thoughts, the embodiment of all the anger, fear, and pain of his previous life, the shadow of Anakin Skywalker.
How did my father die?
A young Jedi named Darth Vader, who was a pupil of mine until he turned to evil, helped the Empire hunt down and destroy the Jedi Knights. He betrayed and murdered your father.
So, I've now alluded multiple times to the concept of a shadow, but what exactly do I mean with that? Well, Carl Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, described the shadow as following. It is a frightening thought that man also has a shadow side to him, consisting not just of little weaknesses and foibles, but of a positively demonic dynamism. Unfortunately, there can be no doubt that man is, on the whole, less good than he imagines himself or wants to be. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. If it is repressed and isolated from consciousness, it never gets corrected. So basically, your own shadow, and trust me, we all have one, is the accumulation of all the most horrible and vile thoughts you've ever had. Emotions that you knew were wrong and so you repressed them. All the thoughts society once told you were not okay to have, shoved away where no one would ever find them again. But the truth is that there were reasons you had these thoughts, reasons that won't go away no matter how much you want them to. And so, the longer you repress those feelings, those vile thoughts that are part of who you are, the bigger and stronger your shadow becomes. The more it fights with you to take control over your body, the more it desperately desires to lash out and act out the most vile of things. Something that we can see manifest itself within our own lives whenever we say or do things that we immediately regret afterwards. Things we thought we would never say or do. And so, as you can see, ignoring one's shadow was never a good idea. After all, it's still part of who you are. A part of yourself that needs to be expressed. And for the record, I'm not implying that any of you start acting out your wildest of fantasies of pushing your boss down the stairs or of strangling some stranger on the streets. But rather, you must find a way to integrate your shadow within your life in a positive manner. To find a way to channel all of this anger and aggression into something positive. Use it as fuel for all the good you intend to do in the world. And also, use it as something that you can be proud of. After all, your shadow is still part of who you are. And so, if you repress it, you're simply repressing yourself. Until your shadow eventually loses its patience and makes you act out all the anger and aggression it has onto yourself. Because if you won't address it, if you won't channel it into something positive, then don't be surprised if it turns on you. Not unlike it did with Anakin. Throughout his entire life, he's been a boy who simply wanted a family. All he ever did was because he so desperately wished to have a family of his own. Even all the power that he seeks, he only does it so he can find a way to save the ones he loves. But this exact obsession is what leads to a huge amount of fear and anxiety, because each loving thought that he has is then contrasted by a dark thought about what he'd do to those who were to come in the way of and destroy this love, making him think of and sometimes even act on some of his worst feelings and emotions. But he is never actually allowed to deal with the dark side that is brewing within him. All he's ever told to do is to be mindful of his thoughts, but he's never taught on how to actually deal with them. And so, all he does for years is repress them, shoving them aside and doing his best to never think of them. Thoughts and emotions he never dared to tackle ever again. But what Anakin was unaware of is that he'd been subconsciously creating a shadow so strong and vile, no one would ever dare to face it. A shadow that had been repressed and ignored for so long, that eventually, when the time was right and Anakin was willing to face even his deepest darkness if it meant it could save Padme, it had already become too big and overwhelming to control. Darth Vader had been allowed out of his cage, and there was no turning back now. Anakin had repressed this side of him for so long that when it was finally allowed to express itself to its fullest, it came back with a vendetta. It took over Anakin's entire being and then made sure to kill off the ego that was known as Anakin Skywalker. The Shadow Self, Darth Vader, did everything in his power to make sure Anakin could never return, throwing him in the same prison Darth Vader had to endure for years. And he did so by going against everything Anakin ever stood up for, going even as far as to kill innocent children.
Master Skywalker, there are too many of them. What are we going to do?
And normally, someone's ego, that part of themselves that they are consciously aware of, and the part we normally identify with, well, it would do everything in its power to stop one's own shadow from taking so much control and doing such horrible things. But as we've previously discussed, Anakin at this point is so broken within, so uncertain of what's right and wrong, that he lacks any proper sense of self. His ego, who he thought he once was, is too weak and broken to prevent any of it. He completely gave in to his shadow because he didn't know what else he could do. And the worst part is that he probably felt some sense of relief afterwards, because there is a sort of intoxicating freedom that comes with allowing rage to take over. It releases us from the limitations we normally feel. But is it truly freedom, or simply us allowing ourselves to fall deep into a pit of despair? So make sure you are wary of your own shadow. As Jordan Peterson and Robert Greene recently discussed,
I go very deeply into the shadow in a chapter in my last book, The Laws of Human Nature. And I try and talk about how one integrates the shadow, because it's not an easy answer for that. You know, people are kind of perplexed. Well, I have this dark side, and I explain a lot of where it comes from. And you have that aggressiveness when you were young, and it got socialized out of you, and then it got repressed. And it's like a lost self that lives inside of you and is screaming to come out. How do you integrate it? And so the main thing is you have to be aware that you have this shadow side. You can't run away from it. You have to acknowledge that it exists. You almost have to embrace it in a way.
A good parent too does everything he or she can not to repress that. Like what you want to do with children is you want them to be forceful. You want them to have some power.
Exactly.
You want them to integrate that capacity for aggression into, well, let's say, lucid conversation. You want them to be able to stand up for themselves in family discussions. If you just punish them for being aggressive, let's say, for talking back or something like that, you don't guide that into more sophisticated development.
If you only knew the power of the dark side. Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father. He told me you killed him. No. I am your father. Luke, you can destroy the Emperor. Join me, and together we can rule the galaxy as father and son.
So, when I tried to summarize this video in one sentence, I realized that someone else had already done that for me. And therefore, I'll let them broadly explain Anakin psychology with the following statement.
Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. I sense much fear in you.
What most of you may not have realized yet is that humans who are naturally tuned to the emotions of others, who are more empathetic, are also more likely to suffer when others are sad or fear when others are scared. Now imagine what this could mean to someone like Anakin, who has been trained to use the Force and who has a stronger connection to it than any other Jedi. After all, someone who can use the Force to manipulate what droids others are looking for may also be easily subject to falling deep into the sorrow of all living beings, of accidentally tapping into the rage and fear of all that exists. And I believe that this is what fuels Anakin's demise. In one word, it's fear. The fear of losing the people he loves, the fear of making the wrong choices, the fear of losing all that he cares for. And the only way he knows how to deal with all this fear is to seek power, to constantly try and obtain more and more control over things he has no control over. And all this fear he has comes from his simple desire to have a family, to have a stable foundation beneath his feet. There is nothing that he regards as more valuable than the idea of a family. Which is also why Anakin dies at the end of Revenge of the Sith. Because after having lost a mother, a father, and even a brother, he finally snaps when he is led to believe that he now also lost a wife and a child, making him believe that there's no chance left for him to create a family of his own. And so he then gives in to his darker side and goes back to being a slave. And some people, they think that it makes no sense for Vader to stay by Palpatine's side after having lost everything, but I think that this is the only thing that actually makes sense in this situation. After all, Anakin craves a family, in my opinion, because he craves stability. Everything in his life is constantly changing, and for a boy who never had a stable safe haven, all he wishes for is something he can rely on. Something stable, something that won't die or change. And so, after losing all hopes of a family that may provide that, all he has now is his existence as a slave. After all, at this point, this is really the only thing that truly never changed in his life. He was born and raised a literal slave. He then became slave through the will of the Jedi Order. And now, in the end, he becomes the Emperor's fist, a constant slave to someone else's will. Therefore, the only stability that he thinks he deserves is that of a mere slave existence. And so, as Darth Vader, he then goes on to make sure that all the suffering he caused, that it must have meant something, that he can now at least make sure that peace and order is brought to his new empire, that no more change and uncertainty is allowed to persist, because in his mind, change seems to only lead to chaos and suffering. It's really only when Luke comes back into his life that Anakin starts to be revitalized from within Darth Vader. And of course he would. Anakin really only ever wanted a family. And so, when Luke comes around, hopes of finally having said family start to pop up again. It truly is incredible. Even now, after years of being a mindless husk of his former self, of being this destructive force of evil, he immediately goes back to try and build up a family again. I mean, when Vader asks Luke to join him and destroy the Emperor, there alone we can already see a glimpse of Anakin returning. But it wouldn't quite happen until the next movie, where Anakin once again is put in a difficult position. On a borderline position of having to once again choose between two completely different outcomes for his life. And while both scenes are quite different, and we may think that in one case he sided with Palpatine and in the other against him, what's truly going on here is that in both cases, he ends up choosing family above all else. He first joins Palpatine only to save his wife, and in the end, he then kills Palpatine only to save his son. Because deep within, all Anakin ever wanted was a sense of stability, a family, the loss of which created a shadow within himself, a shadow he was told to ignore and repress, a shadow who in the end turned on him and almost killed him off for good. Thanks for watching, guys. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Over here we use philosophy and psychology to better understand life and to find our own meaning within it. There are many exciting things coming up, so if I were you, I'd subscribe and turn on notifications to stay up to date. See ya!
I am not a bounty hunter.